Hey everybody, welcome. I am the bedbug guy, and I have a problem. Whenever I'm in some sort of group comment section or even discussing something like the fact that the Sphinx is way older than the mainstream says, the minute that I mention that Khufu built the pyramid and it was totally possible for him to do so, uh, well, to many people, them's fighting words. I am given so much heat over it. Attacks of who the heck are you? What's your evidence? Things like that. I don't understand why you would come after me for having that position. I mean, I get it. Everybody's passionate. So I figured instead of attempting to write a novel in a chat section to explain myself and my position, I would go ahead and do a video, kind of give my background and show how my knowledge and life experience gives me a different perspective when I'm looking at information. Because we don't have to agree to be on the same team, literally. Also, I want to add, sorry about the wind chimes in the background. I am on the porch and it's a little breezy today. If you see my cat appear, any of the three, go ahead and take a shot, of booze, because they may do it. I'll let you know when that happens in the description. So, why do I maintain that Khufu built the pyramid and it was totally possible? Yet, champion alternative researchers. Well, a little bit about me. I have been into Egyptology since I could remember. Going back to about 4, really, when I started to be able to read and get into it, I was about 8, and I was passionately hardcore into this to the annoyance of my family and those around me. Now, the original plan was to get into a really good school and become an Egyptologist. Now, why that didn't come to fruition is a story for another day. It involves my father, and not really relevant. But I tell you what, if for some reason I have 100,000 subscribers one day, I'll do a live, I'll tell the story, and we can all have a group therapy on our childhood traumas, okay? But other than that, I did continue on studying that, although I did go into a different career. I consumed any information I could get, magazines, newsletters from RC, things like that. I also consumed the alternative researchers, John Anthony West, Eric von Daniken, Graham Hancock, Brian Forrester, Christopher Dunn, Stephen Mailer, Richard Childress, all these guys. And the reason is because as much as I have learned about mainstream history, there are lots of mysteries and unanswered questions that the alternative researchers are asking the right questions, in a lot of instances giving great ideas for plausible explanations. Now, I don't have to agree with everything they say, as evidenced by the fact that I occasionally armchair quarterback Graham Hancock, but that's because I want him to be perfect. I actually admire and respect him. Ancient Apocalypse is great. I highly recommend it. Although, Graham, I heard you want to do Egypt for the 3rd season, and just be aware I'm watching. Other than that, as I continued on, so I've amassed all this information. Now, what does this have to do also with pyramid construction? Well, my father was a general contractor. His mother, my grandmother, was an architect and a general contractor, which was a big deal in the 1950s and 60s. I have also been involved in construction, also in the direct construction of my own house. So I'm aware of the construction process, and it kind of gives me a different perspective when I look at information. And just to prove, a person's knowledge base and their life experiences will affect how they interpret information, especially what information is presented to them and how it's presented. Okay? So this is why I can have that dichotomy. And literally, as we go through discussing pyramid construction, from the way I perceive it, it demonstrates that whether Khufu built it in the Fourth Dynasty or not does not dismiss any of the ulterior theories. Okay? Nothing they cite, not the unified plan, not the possibility that an extraterrestrial was helping, not the possibility of a lost ancient civilization. It really doesn't. Not that the tomb, it wasn't a tomb, it was a power plant. It really doesn't take away from that. But somehow, everybody seems to universally want to follow whatever idea that they subscribe to at the expense of the others. But reality, I like to play all sides because I can find the truth, I believe, in by examining everybody, because they all have good points. So, let's talk about pyramid construction. Before I get into that, I want to make two statements that are universal, undisputable truths about the ancient Egyptians. And these things are rarely brought up in any presentation on the subject. Sometimes, but not all the time. I remember it all the time, and I would like everybody else to remember it, no matter what you subscribe to. And the first one is, the ancient Egyptians were brilliant engineers, exceptional problem solvers, and critical thinkers. It's demonstrated throughout their history. The point is that these people were not stupid, primitive people, okay? No matter what you subscribe to, remember that. The second thing is that Egypt as a civilization is older than the unified dynastic Egypt that everybody's pretty much familiar with. So, before the first pharaoh sat on the throne of the entire Egypt, it was already a civilization, already a culture, just many different, more or less city kingdoms. They already had writing, math, they were already working in stone, and they were well into the Bronze Age, before the first dynasty ever came. Okay? So by the time they constructed the Great Pyramid, they had already been working with different types of stone, engineering stone structures, and this wasn't their first pyramid. Whether you question the provenance of the Dashur and Maidum pyramids attributed to Snefru, it still wasn't the first pyramid. So as they say in America, not their first rodeo. So when you're constructing anything, we already know that they had the math and engineering skills and the stone cutting skills to do this. What makes the Great Pyramid a big deal is it's the largest pyramid they ever built, and it has engineered into the interior passageways and multiple rooms, which is very complicated to do. Okay, even for an engineer doing it today, but they achieved it. So when you get out of the architecture and planning stage, you have to have a few things to construct something of this magnitude. And the first one is money. Well, did they have enough money to build this thing? In their view, yes, they didn't use actual money. It was an agricultural-based economy. Well, during this time, remember, they'd already been around for a long time. Their agriculture was down to a science, and they were having, I would say, bumper crops. And by having all this, it was considered wealth. They were literally wealthy beyond the dreams of other civilizations around them at the time. So building this pyramid wasn't just the pharaoh writing a check. It was, he had the whole nation's treasury behind him. Okay. So when you come out of the planning stage, you have the money. The first thing you need to do is hire people. Well, in ancient Egypt, at that time in the Fourth Dynasty, the population was about 1.5 million people. And because their agriculture was so on point, not a lot of those people were devoted to agriculture. So they were able to have people do other things that had nothing to do with agriculture. Standing professional military, doctors, engineers, General laborers, artisans, craftsmen, they had all these available. So, in that, they also had a large segment of the population that needed work, general laborers. So, coming up with 20 or 30,000 workers, not a problem. But in that stage, they have to hire workers and establish logistics. So, in the process of doing that, any construction project, while you're hiring, you also need to place your material orders, which they also would have calculated in the planning stage. And in this case, what did they need? They needed 3 types of stone that they used. Okay, so you got about 2.3 million core limestone blocks. Okay, and that's the bulk of the pyramid. And those were literally quarried right next door on the plateau on the south side of the Great Pyramid. You can go visit that quarry. That's where the vast majority of the stone came from. Also, they needed about 200,000 casing stones. Those come from Tura, which is about 8 miles away, like kind of down and across the river. Not that far away, and not that much. So total, and they also needed granite. So let me give you the statistics. The entire pyramid contains total limestone between what they actually got on site to put up in the pyramid. They got, plus the casing, that's 5.5 million tons of limestone. That was literally right next door. And of that, how much granite is in that pyramid? Because a lot of big deals are made about the granite, because there are some heavy granite pieces. We'll get into that in a minute. But how much granite? 8,000 tons. So you compare it to the entire giant pyramid of 5.5 million tons of easy to cut, easy to transport limestone blocks versus 8,000 tons of granite. It's minuscule in comparison to what the actual pyramid is. And like I said, how information is presented to you will affect your perception. When a lot of people talk about the pyramid, they just focus on those granite blocks. There aren't that many in there compared to the whole thing. So in the grand scheme of how long it takes to build a pyramid, this wasn't jack compared to the entire superstructure. Okay, so they would have placed their orders probably right there on site, told the guys in the quarry, give them the specs and just start cutting. We'll tell you when to stop. Send the specs to Tura, start cutting. We'll tell you when to stop. And send the specs to Aswan, because they're going to need that granite in a few years, and it's going to take a few years to start getting it. Okay, not easy to cut even today. So while this is going on, you also have to do site prep and building temporary support structures. So before the first stone is even hauled into position, they have to level and dig out all the sand, level the bedrock to make the foundation, and build the temporary support structures. And what I mean by that is, if you go to a modern construction site, there's usually a double wide trailer or something. That's the administration center and the break room and all that neat stuff. They did the same thing. They aren't designed to stay there. So in their case, which was actually found recently, that was building a city full of the granaries where they stored all the, basically the pay, and the officials could hang out. There's also an industrial harbor attached to it, capable of basically delivering giant stones. Also, any worker support areas, places to stay and stuff like those. These were all built of mud brick. Once the site was done, these would have been removed to the foundations, which is why you don't find these structures really. One of the big arguments is, where did all the workers stay? Well, they're just now really doing heavy duty excavations on Giza. And once that soccer field was abandoned, they were able to excavate and find the city, which exists. And by the way, Khufu's seals are all over that city. All right? Him and his officials. So, while they're laying the foundation, keep in mind, they're already cutting stone. A lot of people perceive that they were doing this one stone at a time, and nobody builds that way. You order your materials, and as you put it up, you trim as needed. So, whatever precision stonework needed to be, and compared to the entire pyramid perception, the entirety of the stonework was not precise. It was only precise where it needed to be. You hear about not being able to put a razor blade between it. Yeah, that's like casing stones, passageways, rooms, more or less wherever somebody might see it. But the vast majority of it, those core limestones, they're not even uniform. They're rough. They just kind of cranked them out of the quarry, hauled them up, and trimmed them as needed. And you can work limestone pretty quickly. Now, speaking of that, limestone blocks, they range between 1 ton and 2.5 tons each. By the way, easy to transport for a crew of 10 to 20. Why the size discrepancy? As it turns out, the largest limestone blocks are in the bottom layers, just logically. And then the stones got smaller as they went up, which would have made it easier for the crews to transport higher, not to mention less weight really bearing down as you went up. So when you go through all this, once they finish the foundation and the temporary support and get all the laborers in, that's taken a long time. In the meantime, all your stone is already being cut. So by the time they went to haul the first stone into position, they already had probably thousands of blocks staged ready to go. And this is where it goes into timing. They're not doing one at a time. They had probably a minimum of 20,000 laborers working at the same time. That's crew after crew after crew, hauling them into position. So you could get several stones in within 5 minutes. And remember, each layer is smaller than the last one. So as you go up, you're doing less stone. Okay? Now that runs us into a question. How the heck did they get the stone up that high? Because some mainstream say, oh, it was a ramp they built all the way to the top. Well, that really doesn't make sense, because after a certain point, the ramp is really gonna cost more than the pyramid. Okay, so up to a certain point, yes, but not really. And then they talked about a spiral ramp on the outside. That really wouldn't work because you don't have any way to really support that going all the way up, which is we're going to talk about an architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin, who retired and spent 10 years trying to figure this out. Now, he has not been discredited despite what anybody heard, and his theory on this was, after that certain point, they actually built a spiral ramp into the pyramid. Okay, it's inside. Now, you may think that's wild, but unbeknownst to him, there were scans being done of the pyramid, and they did a thermal scan that found a low-density spiral exactly where he said it would be, and they couldn't make heads or tails of it until they found his work, and then it made sense. And it's indicative of that spiral was open and then loosely backfilled as they were done. So that answers that. Now, as far as getting those giant granite beams up to the top, I'm going to leave that a mystery. But they had 20,000 people, so brute force is still not out of the question. But the possibility of some sort of unknown technology is open, because I'm going to tell you what, I know how they got the stones down the river, but I can't tell you how the heck they got all that heavy granite onto the boat in Aswan and then off the boat at the destination. You got me there. Even though I know they had an understanding of mechanical advantages and gravity assist, which is demonstrated by their device called the Shadoof, which is basically a crane they've used since almost prehistoric times to pull water out of the river. It shows an understanding of assistance and mechanical advantage. Let's talk about the alignment of the pyramid, because a big deal is made about the fact that it's aligned very, very closely to the 4 cardinal directions. Well, how they did this, as it turns out, is not a mystery. They actually recorded and documented more than once how they aligned their monuments. And it was done celestially, and it's called the stretching of the cord ceremony, and this particular one is from a temple wall. And what they did is they had a goddess in charge of this named Seshat, and an important official, even the pharaoh, might participate in this ceremony. And how they did it is they had two long poles tied together with a rope. And as it turns out, on a solstice in the morning, if you put a pole straight up and down in the ground, the shadow of that pole will point an exact, almost exact east-west shadow. And if you take the other pole and pull it out and stretch it tight so that rope runs straight on that shadow, and put it in the ground and mark that line, that particular foundation wall will face east to west, and the faces of the wall will be north to south. And then you just measure in around it. The Greeks learned this technique from the Egyptians and used it, and the Romans also used this technique. So it's not really, it's amazing, but it's how they did it is not really a mystery. So in the end, there's no problem with this being constructed during the Fourth Dynasty. It really isn't. They had the know-how, they had the materials. Like I said, sometimes your perception of the information will determine what you think about it. Okay, now, one thing I'd like to say, it is often brought up in arguments that this couldn't be done today. You couldn't build an exact replica of this pyramid today, right? Well, that's not the correct statement. The question is not, could we do it? Because actually, it could be done. The question is, would you be able to do it? And that, sadly, is no. And the reason I say that, here's the general contractor thing. Well, first of all, in the modern age, it might take 20 years to get that permit if you could even get one. Okay? Secondly, you'd be hard-pressed to get any sort of liability insurance. Building a pyramid that way is extraordinarily dangerous, and people got killed. Okay? You would have your job site shut down by code inspectors, OSHA inspectors, you name it. You would never be able to get it done. That's why no contractor would take on that job. You present them with this and they'll say, I could build you a bigger one that's hollow on the inside that'll last 30,000 years, which is true. That's modern construction methods. So you could do it, but nobody would, because it's just not practical in today's world. Back then, this was the only way they could do it. So like I said, Khufu building the pyramid. Like I said, his name's all over it. There's even the ship's log of Mary Ray, hauling buttloads of Tura to Giza for Khufu. And there's only one reason you would need all that Tura, is if you're building a pyramid. Even if you acknowledge or you're on board that Khufu built that pyramid during the Fourth Dynasty, it doesn't negate anything. It doesn't negate the unified plan theory. It doesn't negate Robert Roval's theory about Orion's belt. It doesn't negate the theory of an advanced lost Ice Age civilization. It doesn't negate the theory that the tomb was something other than a tomb. It was a power plant. It was, name it, a water pump. Could be, because there is some mystery there. No evidence of anybody being buried in that pyramid has ever been found, right? So everybody's theory is good until one is proven correct. I said, it doesn't have to be older just for those theories to be correct. We can't be guilty of doing the same thing that the mainstream does and just taking everything in context because we don't have the answer. And in this case, they both do it. Mainstream says the Sphinx was built by Khafre because it's sitting next to all the pyramids. They were all built at the same time. It's in context. Who cares that the Sphinx is weathered to hell and the construction of the temples around it clearly don't match the construction of the pyramids? Now you flip that, and alternative researchers say the same thing. Well, the Sphinx could be 10 or 11,000 years old, therefore the pyramids must be no, they're clearly different. If you sit there and look at it, it's clearly two different types of construction, two different times. They don't have to be grouped together. Now, if you want a real mystery, the Sphinx being that old and the pyramids being built there, is it possible something else was on that plateau before the first pyramid was even built there? I'm going to say it's entirely possible. So I'm sure people want to drop some hate in the comments. That's fine. If you think I'm wrong, please cite your source and cite the evidence if you want me to check it out. The whole reason I started this channel was because, much like back then, today, nobody wants to talk about this stuff, so I'm literally looking for people to talk to. If you say something in there that I know I said in this video, I know you didn't watch it. But don't cite somebody's book. You have to cite evidence. Just chances are you cite somebody's book, I've already read it. And that's not evidence. Evidence. Anyway, that's enough of that for today. I'll see everybody later. Thanks. Bye.